Hi, everyone, and welcome to Breaking the Spell. Today's session is a really special one. I'm very honored to have a guest on that is a professor of philosophy, and we're going to talk a lot about aging, mortality, and existentialism. This special guest today with us is Kevin Aho, and he's a professor of philosophy and chair of Department of Communication and Philosophy at the Florida Gulf Coast University. First thing, thanks, Kevin, for being on to our show.
It's my pleasure.
Right. So just to give a quick background to our viewers, so Kevin has published widely in the areas of existentialism, phenomenology, hermeneutics, the philosophy of health and fitness, health and illness, sorry. He's the author of numerous books such as Existentialism and Introduction, Context of Suffering, a Heideggerian Approach to Psychopathology, Heidegger's Neglect of the Body, and co-author of Body Matters, a phenomenology of sickness, disease, and illness. He's also the editor of Existential Medicine, Essays on Health and Illness, and the co-editor of Dostoevsky's Notes from the Underground. But yeah, well, today, why I have Kevin on is really because of this book. So it's called One Beat More. I've read it. Just to say the full title, One Beat More, Existentialism and the Gift of Mortality. And just to quote, the blurbs on the book, it's part memoir, it's a guide to existentialism, it weaves personal history and substantive philosophical ideas. It's a really beautiful book. It really speaks to me about the profound truths about how to live, how to age in an authentic manner. And I will leave it to Kevin to describe what was the real life event that led him to confront death for the first time, and how he wrestled with feelings of anxiety, and how he learned to cope with those feelings with philosophical ideas from existentialists such as Kierkegaard, Heidegger, Nietzsche, and Beauvoir. At the same time as we're discussing about the book, I really hope to introduce existentialism to any person who's unfamiliar with this philosophy, just to kind of give a bit of a ground to start off on existentialism. The impression I get from talking to friends, and those who may have heard the word being tossed around, is that this is a very angsty, very nihilistic philosophy. All young people will go through it, but once they enter working life or their middle age, they'll see this as a passing phase. And so existentialism is like a school of thought for kids. And I really believe that this book, not just this book, but every other book that I've been able to read from Kevin, it really disproves that notion. I think existentialism has a lot to offer. It's very meaningful and inspiring, and it has a lot to say also for other areas of life, and that involves politics, of oppression and resistance, psychiatry, mental illness, sexuality, and I hope that we will have some time for diving into those topics as well. So Kevin, okay, time for me to stop talking. I'd like you to jump in right now. So the first question we always have for our guests is, when was the first time you realized something was not right with the world? And did that lead you down to the path of finding existentialism? And I figured you might as well at the same time try to define existentialism for our viewers.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, I think existentialism as a philosophical attitude taps into a feeling that all of us have from time to time. And that feeling conveys the sense that something's not right with me. It seems like everyone else is doing just fine, but something's not right with me. I don't feel like I fit or I belong in this world. And that's a very anxious feeling. It's uncanny, it's disorienting. And thankfully, those moments are fleeting, and we can kind of get sucked back into everyday life and go through our routines and our daily habits. But what existentialism wants to teach us is that those fleeting moments actually reveal deep truths about the human condition. And that's really what existentialism is a philosophy about. It's an analysis or an examination of what it means to be human. What is the human condition? What do we have to struggle with and confront as we live our lives? And oftentimes this struggle involves a set of overlapping givens. the primordial given of our condition is the fact that we're going to die, that we are finite temporal beings, and we don't know when our death will come. It can come at any moment. This is what Kierkegaard calls our most uncertain certainty. In addition to this, we realize another given is the fact that we are free to create ourselves, that there is no pre-given nature that determines who we are, that human beings are self-making or self-fashioning beings. So freedom is a central component of existentialist philosophy. Another given of our condition is the unsettling realization that there are no moral absolutes that can guide us and tell us what to do with our lives. That means in terms of the enduring impact of our existence, our life is meaningless. It's absurd. But just because it's meaningless in a cosmic or enduring sense doesn't mean we live without meaning. It means that we create meaning through our own choices and actions. So death, freedom, meaninglessness are three fundamental givens of the human condition. And a fourth given is the realization that we have from time to time that I'm all alone in the world, that no one can really understand what I'm going through. No one can enter into my own experience, get into my skin, and know my feelings, my moods, my needs and desires. And so that sense of deep loneliness or isolation is also characteristic of the existential attitude. And what existentialism as a philosophy wants to suggest is that when we confront those givens, those anxious givens of our condition, and integrate them into our lives, it actually intensifies our life and gives it a sense of urgency that it otherwise wouldn't have. So this notion that we have of existentialism as this morbid, nihilistic, navel-gazing discipline or area of philosophy is actually misleading. Existentialism is, if anything, a life-affirming philosophy, a recognition that this is not a dress rehearsal. This is the only life you have. And when you recognize that it's the only life you have and you have the responsibility to create that life, to be true to yourself, life takes on a kind of seriousness and urgency that otherwise it wouldn't have. And this is why Nietzsche, for instance, refers to his philosophy as a gay science, a happy philosophy. It's not a morbid philosophy. It's a philosophy that brings with it a kind of gratitude and seriousness that we otherwise often take for granted. Now, in my own experience, I was always kind of an anxious child, an anxious kid growing up. I was a worrier. But in addition to being kind of dispositionally anxious, I was also deeply curious about the world. I was curious about other people. I was curious about the natural world. I was the kid that would eavesdrop on other people's conversations to see what they would be talking about. And I was fortunate enough to be raised in a home of intellectually inclined parents. My father was a professor of sociology, but really his interest was German social theory, which has deep resonances with existential philosophy and phenomenology. And my mother was a poet, a writer. And so there were always books in the house and intellectual conversations going on that allowed me to kind of cultivate that curiosity about the world. And when I went off to college, I decided I would major in something that everyone else majors in, and it will get me a good job and a good salary. And I decided to go into engineering. So my freshman year in college, I was an engineering major. And I happened in my second semester to take a general education philosophy course, Introduction to Philosophy or Introduction to Western Philosophy. And in that course, we were assigned to read the great Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov. And I was thoroughly transformed when I read Dostoevsky for the first time. It felt like the anguish of his characters is something that I could relate to, that I felt the philosophical tension in my own life when I would read about Alyosha Karamazov and Ivan Karamazov and Dmitry Karamazov. I felt those brothers in me. And that semester, I changed my major to philosophy and never looked back. Now, with that said, most of mainstream philosophy I find quite boring and uninteresting. Asking questions about the nature of truth, the distinction between appearances and reality, what is right conduct, what is good and evil, what is virtue, what is justice. None of those questions really, they were interesting questions, but they didn't strike me as urgent and compelling in the way that existentialist philosophy did. When I would study existentialism, it was a life and death issue. It felt deeply serious and deeply personal. And so as I developed my intellectual life through college and graduate school, I gravitated to those classes: existentialism, phenomenology, sometimes social and political philosophy from the European or continental tradition. And that just kind of consolidated more and more my interests and my passions. And as I got older, I realized that the jarring impact of existentialism that I had when I was a young college student kept coming back to me as relevant when I would go through certain crises in my life. I dropped out of a couple of graduate schools in a state of disenchantment and frustration. I went through a divorce, had a number of failures in life, and every time those crises or upheavals hit me, existentialism would come back and remind me, this is actually what it means to be human. It's to have your world collapse periodically throughout your life. And that experience of world collapse is really oftentimes what the existentialists mean by dying or death. Your identity dies, your ego dies, and you have to now recreate yourself once again. And of course, all of that came to a head about 6 years ago, and I had a massive heart attack. And I had to turn to existentialist philosophy to kind of extricate myself from the anguish and the debris that my life had become. And writing the book was tremendously cathartic and therapeutic in the healing process. And so that's how One Beat More came about.
Yeah, I have to say, first thing, a few points I'd like to draw on, similarities between us. First thing, for Santosh, he used to be in an engineering course, if I'm not wrong, Santosh. You were, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Engineer by training.
Made a life change to studying, in some sense, spiritual studies and philosophy. So that's one point for you. For me, along with you, Kevin, I also experienced quite a number of life crisis and collapses. So I've also went through divorce. I've talked about it on the channel. I've also gone through a business failure. So I've also gone through those kind of episodes. And it's very funny, right, Kevin, when you talk about this, it reminds me, or it seems to me like as if existentialism as a philosophy, it only has a certain appeal for those of us who have gone through serious shit in life. And maybe that's why, some people are not drawn to it, because maybe they have quite a pretty good, for themselves. I mean, I'm happy for people who don't have to go through crisis, but if they don't, then I guess they never have to come to terms with, as you said, anxiety, meaninglessness, and despair.
Well, the thing that's interesting, and I think you're right, I think some individuals live charmed lives, but those charmed lives don't go on forever. That you do get older, your parents die, relationships fall apart, your body breaks down. And that's why I argue that old age, getting older, actually makes us more open to the insights of existentialism, because suffering is going to come and you can't escape it. You will get ill, people that you care about and love will die. You will go through crises and upheavals in your life, and you can turn away from them or recoil from them or deny that they're going to happen, but that's going to make the crisis even more difficult. what existentialism does is it creates kind of reservoirs of resiliency by, instead of recoiling from the emergencies in life, it forces you to turn toward them and integrate them into your life. And so crises can be regarded as opportunities for personal growth and transformation, and also opportunities to let go of our egoistic clinging to attachments to our jobs, our careers, our physical body, our wealth, our material possessions. Death and aging put all of those things in perspective, that they don't make our lives richer, they don't enhance the capacities for human flourishing. And existentialism as a philosophy kind of distills out those distractions and trivialities and forces us to focus on what really matters in life.
Yeah, and along with what you just said, I just wanted to add also, I concur with you that as much as I try to read widely in philosophy on even the other more abstract topics you talk about, like virtues and metaphysical questions, but there's always some kind of emotional distance from those topics. You don't feel like your life is to change if you believe in some other theory of consciousness or something like that. Santosh, why don't you do you want to ask something first before I go to my first question regarding his book?
I mean, I just had an insight. It's not just for personal transformation and growth, but it's also for community. It's also a lot about authentic, raw, vulnerable connection with other human beings who feel the same thing. And that is very enduring. And it's also, and that community creates a space for healing and for shared connection and shared growth. Yeah, so that was an insight that came to my mind.
I think it's a very good point. And I think one of the misleading stereotypes of existentialism is that it's a radically individualistic project, that existentialism, much to the fault of some existentialists, especially the young Jean-Paul Sartre, is that existentialism was conflated with subjectivism. But that this is just wrong. I mean, the recognition of our shared vulnerability, of our relationship with finitude and suffering, deepens our capacities for compassion and connectedness. And you see this in so much of the existentialist tradition, especially in the religious existentialists, in figures like the Jewish philosopher Martin Buber, in the writings of Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, who were both influenced by the Russian Orthodox Church. You see this in Gabriel Marcel, the French Catholic existentialist conception of communion. And you even see it in Heidegger's conception of being with others. And so it's a little bit misleading to think that our confrontation with the desperate givens of existence are a solitary affair. That confrontation makes it possible for us to create community, reach out in love and tenderness to other people that are suffering. And that's one of the themes in this new book, that when I was in states of profound suffering in the wake of my heart attack, I realized how dependent and vulnerable I actually was, and it enhanced my capacity for love and care.
Yeah, so let me get into that. I really want to get into what you just said about community and how all the different existentialists, countered this, false idea of existentialists being very individualistic or subjectivist. We'll get to that later, I hope. I really want to do that. But I get to your first opening chapter of your book, which is titled How to Die, or Learning How to Die, sorry. And, you set out the case, and it goes back to what you said just now about death and aging are pre-givens, right? They're just intrinsic to the human condition. And you set out the case in the opening chapter that it's easy to deceive ourselves and to live in a state of apparent invulnerability when one is young and healthy, and that wouldn't seem to apply to us. But sadly speaking, as we get older and our bodies weaken, we have illnesses, we see our friends and family members, as you say, passed away. And then that's where we realize the fragility of existence, and it pushes us towards a very important concept in existentialism, which is authenticity. And so, like I said, when I read this, it made me think of something, which is a very simple example which we see in contemporary culture. So, suppose we see an elderly person that's like, walking down the street, and this person is dressed in a way that's like trying to pass off as if he or she is still in her 20s or 30s, right? And let's even assume this person goes as far as to have plastic surgery and maybe applies copious amount of cosmetics. And what I feel is that there's always two types of responses, right? And one is some people would praise that as, this person being honest or being authentic, and maybe even being brave, because this person is not afraid of being judged. But there's another one, another kind of response, which is more cynical, and that is, this person should act more their age and maybe recognize that they're no longer, that young. There is the gray hair, there is the wrinkles, don't deny it. So I'd like to ask you, Kevin, how would you analyze those responses, and what is actually the existentialist judgment in this scenario?
Well, one of the things about existentialism is that we can't really judge another person's experience because we're not living through their own existence and we're not inside their skin. So we can't really judge the woman who is elderly, but trying to pass as someone who's much younger by undergoing extensive plastic surgery or acting with a kind of false youth and energy. But generally what we see in our culture, which is deeply ageist, we live in a profoundly ageist and dehumanizing culture when it comes to our interpretation or views of the elderly. We can either deny old age, deny that we're old, and cling to youth with a kind of desperation, which can lead to cosmetic surgery and fad diets and dressing in particular ways that aren't age appropriate. Or we can resign ourselves that we're moving irrevocably towards death and deterioration, and just kind of in anguish shrug our shoulders and say, what's the point? So that those two attitudes of denial and resignation, neither of those capture the richness of old age. The old age as an opportunity for certain aspects of wisdom that were concealed from us when we were younger and caught up in careers and ego-driven projects. And so what I'm trying to say in this book is that whether we deny our aging bodies or resign ourselves to our aging bodies, neither one of those approaches tells us anything interesting about what aging provides us. That there's something about growing old that can enrich our lives, that can deepen and enhance our experience. And central to that experience of enrichment and enhancement is the recognition that time is short. I can't take the future for granted. And I have to appreciate and acknowledge that this fleeting moment is precious. This conversation with a neighbor, this experience on the couch with my beloved cat, this piece of music or that television program, that walk in the woods or that project in the garden, those are things that I can't take for granted anymore. And so one of the things that's interesting in some empirical studies in an area of psychology called socio-emotional selectivity theory is that happiness is actually U-shaped through the course of a lifespan. That oftentimes we're kind of happy and filled with energy when we're children and even adolescents. And then there's a progressive dip in life as we are burdened with the responsibilities of carving out a life and a career and a job. And then it reaches its low point in middle age, as you're at the peak of your powers in work and family and child rearing. And then as you move into retirement and old age, happiness actually goes up again. And you're at your happiest in a normal lifespan in your late 60s and 70s. And part of that, according to some aspects of social emotional selectivity theory, is the recognition that many of the projects and obsessions that consumed us in youth and middle age didn't bring us happiness. And we become much more selective in our commitments and our relationships and the projects that we embark on. And part of that selectivity is the recognition that time is short. I'm not going to waste time with shallow, meaningless conversations about shopping and travel and cocktail parties. I'm going to talk about what really matters about life and devote my time to the people that I really care about and love. And so one of the themes of this book is to kind of re-envision how we view old age, that old age is actually a time of profound insight and wisdom that can actually bring us greater happiness, greater joy, and openings for different degrees of human flourishing, even as our body breaks down and even as we lose loved ones and friends in old age.
Yeah, you know that psycho-emotional stage development, right? The rebound of the happiness. I find that very strikingly similar to how you in the book actually talked about the parallels between existentialism and Hinduism, and that this system of ashrama, the 4 stages, right? Yeah. So I'd like to go into that later, but because you're just talking about our ageist society, and because, you know, I want to talk a little bit about how going back again to that theme of like self-deception, or maybe in this case at a societal level, right? As you write, and you drew on, you know, Kierkegaard in this case, that we actually inhibit in society certain cultural institutions and social practices that repress our anxiety about death and keep it hidden from us. I'll just quote you a little bit from the book. You wrote, we have children in the hope of living on in them after we're gone. We obsess about fitness and diet and cosmetically alter our physical appearance in our efforts to stay young. We treat aging and death as medical problems that can be solved with new treatments and technologies. And you know, this phrase, this passage that I just quoted, this was in reference to how Kierkegaard even thought that in the 19th century, society already had this kind of tendencies. So I would say, obviously, this tendencies are excavated by now, perhaps, you know, in our current century. So, you know, I'd like to ask you, as you said, right, we need to have a honest way of confronting aging, and one that's more life-affirming. So what would a society that embarks on this kind of projects look like? A society that actually confronts, you know, this ageist tropes and actually reaffirms, you know, aging and death in an authentic manner?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. It's something I've struggled with a lot. And, you know, Kierkegaard really did pioneer this conception of death denial and living in states of self-deception. Those conceptions were then developed. I mean, Tolstoy, of course, in his famous book, The Death of Ivan Ilyich. And then Heidegger develops this extensively in the second half of his book, Being and Time. But one of the things to kind of get clear about from an existentialist perspective is that self-deception, or living in this state of denial about our own death, isn't a bad thing. It's not, you're not morally, you're not immoral for doing this. It's not a value judgment. In fact, self-deception is actually a structure of the human condition, according to Heidegger. He calls it falling. We're always going to fall prey to these forms of self-deception. Sartre and Beauvoir will call it bad faith, different degrees of self-deception, and it's just inescapable. As Nietzsche says, this is just, we're human, all too human, and we're frightened of death. It terrifies us, and so we build societies in such a way to shelter us from death by creating religions, by creating institutions that cover over or conceal death, institutions like hospitals that you know, take corpses out through the back door so that we never have to see them. In the book, I even go so far as to say we don't even like using the word death because of the terror it evokes. We use euphemistic phrases like he passed on, or he's in a better place now, or it's part of God's plan. All of those are normal and acceptable forms of self-deception. But what the existentialists want to make clear is it's still self-deception. You're still being dishonest with yourself, and it's still a manifestation of inauthenticity. So what we need to do is to work as a society or as a culture to integrate death acceptance into our lives, to have open and honest conversations and opportunities to explore human finitude and recognize that death is inscribed in our being, and there's no way that we can evade it or escape from it. Now, one of the things that's so problematic in the modern age is that we become so sophisticated at how we can cover over and conceal death. We partition the elderly in old folks' homes and nursing homes. Most of us die now in hospitals as opposed to in our own homes. So in Kierkegaard's time, death was kind of baked into everyday life. You would see death every day. Generations of one family would live under the same roof. And this is still the case in certain societies and certain cultures. And in those cultures where generations live and take care of one another in the same home, there is often less death anxiety in those cultures. We often find this in indigenous cultures, in Latin American and South American cultures, in certain African cultures. But in modern Western cultures, it doesn't fly. We live in a profound situation of death anxiety. And I don't know what to say in terms of envisioning new ways to be honest and open about death, except through education and creating discursive spaces in a society where we can talk honestly and openly about the human condition. There's an interesting movement, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, called Death Over Dinner. And it's a movement where friends and family and maybe colleagues from work will get together and share a meal and talk. The only thing to talk about is death. And what does it mean to live with death clearly in view? How would they like to die? Sometimes an exercise with Death Over Dinner would be writing your own obituary. What would you like your obituary to say in terms of the life you've lived? Sometimes it involves estate planning. How would you like to discuss end-of-life care or do not resuscitate measures if you're in a state of terminal illness? And sometimes it discusses dying with dignity, physician-assisted suicide. Is that something that you might be considering? All of those, I think, would create little ruptures in the status quo of death denial. And so I don't think these structural changes would ever occur through political bodies or political organizations and large cultural institutions. I think it occurs on the grassroots level of communities getting together and talking, sharing books, saying, hey, I just read One Beat More. You might want to take a look at it. It's very interesting. Watching certain kinds of movies, interesting films that explore these topics. And there's so many good movies out there, from Akira Kurosawa to Terrence Malick. Great pieces of film, pieces of literature that might be helpful in demystifying death anxiety. And then sometimes psychotherapy, existentially informed therapies can create inroads into cultural transformation. But I don't think it's going to happen on large scales. It's going to happen on small, localized, grassroots community levels.
Yeah, I agree with that. I now that you spoke about how this kind of openness to death and how it assuages death anxiety and how it's particular to certain societies, I was just thinking of my cultural group being Asian and Chinese, and there is in fact a film out there. I just can't remember the name of it right now, but it stars Awkwafina, and it's a film where she actually pretends as if the death of the grandmother is not impending, and the family undertake this exercise where they try to not tell the grandmother that she's got a cancer diagnosis, and they want her to live still thinking that she's going to live for many years. And the interesting thing about the film was that Awkwafina's character was the one struggling with it, because having been born in America or brought with a set of ideas, she really wanted to tell her grandmother that you are dying and that you have cancer. And You know, so yeah, I agree with you. I think this does have to happen on a much more smaller grassroots kind of level. But I do want, yeah.
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say just one last note that I do personally do agree with the idea of some form of examining physician-assisted suicide. It's certainly something that, you know, if you adopt a existentialist outlook, you really do care about the state of your being when you're, you know, when you're old and dilapidated. And yeah, Santosh, by the way, do you want to add something in?
I think a lot of this is tied to political economy. So we have economic theories that are based on growth that is incessant, exponential, extraction and exploitation. And there is no such thing as degrowth. There's no such thing as regenerative economics, where you grow and then you regenerate, because what grows needs to decline and then it becomes fuel for the next stage of growth. So a lot of this is tied to just economic development and economic growth. And that's why it will never be mainstream. It will always be at the margins. Yeah,
I think that's a great point. And think about that ceaseless growth assumption that's built into modern capitalism and market economies. How does that shape our interpretation of the elderly, the sick, the disabled, the dying? They are not productive members of society.
They're not economically productive. Yeah.
Yeah, they bring no value. And we saw how that stereotype or that prejudice emerged during COVID. That the elderly were started to be viewed as expendable. Well, it's okay if the elderly die. We got to reopen the economy. And so if some old folks died, that's okay. And it's a horrible thing to have witnessed. And it also exposes certain aspects of modern healthcare. I mean, well, I don't want to blame physicians. The structure of modern healthcare is imbued with death denial. That this is something that Atul Gawande wrote so beautifully about in his book, Being Mortal. He's an endocrine surgeon and explores how poorly equipped physicians are in talking honestly and openly about death. And when they face a terminal case or a case that cannot be fixed by technological interventions, they just leave the room. They don't know what to say. They don't know what to do. And so they leave it to the spiritual advisor or the social worker or the therapist to come in. And so this idea of physician-assisted suicide or empowering someone who is in a terminal state to make a decision about whether or not they want to go on living is interestingly becoming more of a pressing topic in biomedical ethics. And there are some states in the US where physician-assisted suicide is legal and accepted. And of course, in some Western European countries as well. So that's one interesting place where important inroads are being made regarding honesty and openness about a life worth living.
Yeah, I have to say, we are based in Singapore. We don't have that kind of policy. So I've actually thought about, like, when I'm old and frail and dying, I need to go to those countries and you know, make a decision for myself.
No, I totally am with you on that. Yeah, I'm actually planning it. So
Right.
it's certainly something that's on my radar.
Right. And yeah, I just want to also add in, like, I like what you just said about how during the pandemic, I was also just as appalled to see that kind of voices, and you know, it's coming very clearly from the political right about how we should just forget about, you know, the elderly and the old, and you know, the economy is what's most important. And it can be seen almost not just in America but in other places as well. Yeah. Okay, but you know, on that note, let's talk about also, you know, your personal journey and you kind of letting go. And this is in your chapter in the book, this idea about letting go. And it boils down to basically this idea in existentialism, but also in other philosophies like Buddhism, that there is no enduring self, and that fundamentally we are always in this state of vulnerability and tenuous state of self-creation. And Kevin, I like the example you used for yourself. You said you left the hospital, you found yourself weak and fatigued, and quoting you, you ask yourself, if I'm not a strong, healthy, energetic college professor, what am I? And I ask that question about myself too as I get older. If I'm not, healthy and strong, then what am I? Another interesting example you actually used in the book was also a 90-year-old immigrant, Ping Wong, and she's someone who's suffering from arthritis. She lives on food stamps. She spoke rudimentary English, but you use her as an example to say that what stood out is her ability to adapt and to be flexible and to let go of superficial attachments. So look, within all this, what was really important was the exploration of Heidegger's concepts of equanimity, steadiness, resoluteness, and you just thrown the word just now. You used the word just now, tone projection. And I'm not going to embarrass myself by trying to speak the German words here. So I was hoping if you could just help our viewers to understand what Heidegger was talking about and how you can relate that to your experience and to helping our viewers maybe understand going beyond a permanent self.
Yeah, it's an interesting point because I have been reading and writing and teaching existentialism for 20 some odd years now, and even though I understand existentialist philosophy and conceptually, it was my health emergency that made it viscerally apparent to me that I am not who I thought I was. And I was what's the word? I had always self-identified with my own physical fitness. I was always a healthy, fit, athletic person. I was a big skier and trail runner when I lived out west, and always in the gym. And when I had my heart attack, I was on a 60-mile bike ride, solo bike ride through South Florida, which I would do regularly during the months. And when I had my heart attack, that whole self-interpretation of someone who was strong and capable and physically fit came crashing down. And I recognized that it was an illusion all along, that part of my obsession with fitness was repressed death anxiety. As long as I was fit and healthy, death didn't apply to me. It applied to other people. And so it just shows you how, even if you're intellectually aware of what authenticity is, it's so easy to be deceived in states of inauthenticity and to live this kind of illusion that there's something fixed and enduring about the self. Now, with respect to Heidegger, Heidegger arguably provides the most comprehensive and thematically rich account of authenticity among all the existentialists. The second half of his major work, which is called Being in Time, is devoted almost entirely to the question of authenticity. And central to his conception of authenticity is this idea of what he calls resoluteness. And we have to, if we're going to be authentic, have an attitude of resoluteness towards our own death or towards our own vulnerability. But what's often confusing to readers of Heidegger for the first time is they confuse resoluteness with a kind of rigidity, a kind of soldierly attitude, very masculinist. And you imagine the authentic individual in Heidegger like an existential stormtrooper that charges headlong towards death and embraces it. That's not how Heidegger is employing the German word that he uses in Being in Time. The word that he uses is Entschlossenheit, which is sometimes translated as resoluteness. But the stem of that word Schließen means to be open, Schließen is to be closed or shut up, confined. And Entschließen means to open, to be open and receptive and flexible with who you are. And so part of what it means to be resolute in the sense of authentic resoluteness for Heidegger is to always be ready for your identity to collapse, because it will collapse over and over and over in your life. And you have to be ready and willing to let go of old identities that are no longer livable. And recognize that you have to adapt and flex as those crises come over us. And the more we rigidly cling to our old identities and hold on to them for dear life, the more we suffer, the more we live in a state of self-deception and evasion, and our anxiety grows and it increases. And so when Heidegger uses these words like authentic Dasein or resolute Dasein, Dasein is the colloquial German word for everyday existence. It's the kind of existence that belongs to humans. So when he talks about authentic existence, he's talking about an existence where the human being is open and flexible to the ever-present possibility of the collapse of their world. And again, this is one of the reasons why I think growing older and moving into old age prepares us for becoming more existential-like, because old age is oftentimes one series of episodes of collapse. You know, you retire from work, that's a collapse. Friends and family die, that's a collapse. Serious physiological breakdowns occur, that's a collapse. Being placed in a nursing home or long-term care facility, that's another world collapse. And so you're just confronted over and over for many, many years of your world and your identity collapsing over and over. And that's what Peng Wang embodies in that example, in that chapter, that she has learned how to adapt and be flexible so that when bad things happen, you let it happen and then you let go. And there's no reason to worry about and obsess about and hold on to former identities, because those identities were an illusion all along. They weren't real. They weren't substantial or thing-like in any sense. And so in terms of Heidegger's philosophy, he develops this much more robustly in his later philosophy, where the idea of authentic being towards death is actually replaced with this conception of openness to mystery, which he captures in this German word Gelassenheit, which literally translates as letting beings be, or letting go of things, releasing yourself from your attachment to things, and being open to mystery. And mystery now is how he's understanding death. So instead of this kind of confusing notion of a singular confrontation with your own finitude, it becomes much more Buddhist, this notion of an openness and receptivity to the mystery of existence and the ambiguity of existence. And he wants to cultivate that as his version of authenticity. And one of the things I try to suggest in this chapter is that this becomes easier to do as you get older. It becomes easier to accept and own up to the mystery of not just the cosmos, but the mystery of your own existence. And the fact that all of the things you thought you knew about life when you were in youth and in middle age have fallen apart. And I use this quote in the book from Carl Jung, the great psychoanalyst and colleague of Freud's. As he moves towards his death in his 80s, he starts to explore in his autobiography how everything he thought he knew about himself has fallen apart, that all of the threads that kind of bound his identity together have kind of become frayed and tangled up. And he's okay with that. He's okay with the fact that he does not know anything. I don't know how the world is. I don't know who I am. And that's okay. And so you have this sense of a kind of serenity in mystery. Instead of freaking out and recoiling from mystery, you open up and let it come.
Yeah, and in fact, I have a question later, because when it comes to close to talking about the end of your book, I feel like you found that moment, that transformation for yourself. So I really want to ask you about that later. But because you just start talking about the collapses, right, that we go through as we pass through aging, as we age, right? And that brings me to one of the most meaningful chapters in your book, which is the one called "The World Has Become Smaller." And you know, as a physical trainer, I'm a physical trainer by profession. I really am someone who's discontented with various platitudes out there in my industry. You know, this idea that age is just a number, and you know, if you just there are no limits on the human body if you just put your mind through it. In fact, I like the opening quote of Nietzsche in that chapter, which goes, "You are your own body and nothing besides." And, that really to me speaks to how, who we are, what we become. Yes, it's very much dependent on, at the same time, the mental thoughts and beliefs that we have, but, the state of our body, and the more we become attuned to our body and its defects, right, as we age. And so what I want to ask you is because, so to me, right, after reading that chapter, I feel like we need to have a footnote to that very famous existentialist quote from Sartre, the one that goes, existence precedes essence. But I feel like the footnote should be like, essence still exists. There's still an essence, I think. And I think when I read your book, your this whole journey of you going through that crisis, that health crisis you had and aging, I feel like you actually described an essentialist account of aging that's universal. I think it's perennial. It's probably unavoidable for everyone. And I want to ask you, I think, in line with what you just said just now, right? In a sense of accepting mysteries and stuff like that. I feel like to have a sophisticated understanding of the kind of existential freedoms that we can develop, we also need to have a richer understanding of what's essential to human nature, or to certain forms of essentialisms like biological. I mean, do we need also to understand that as well?
It's an interesting question. One of the things, first of all, let me explain that conception of existence precedes essence for the listeners or for the audience that may not be familiar. So existence precedes essence is a foundational principle in existentialist philosophy. It's oftentimes attributed to Jean-Paul Sartre, who actually used that line in a lecture he gave in the 1940s called Existentialism as a Humanism. But it actually goes back to Heidegger in Being in Time, where Heidegger says Dasein's essence is its existence. And we also see a version or incarnations of that in Kierkegaard's philosophy. What it means is that humans are different from all other beings, non-human organisms, and any other thing, because there's no pre-given essence that determines who we are. It's not your anatomy, your biology, your socioeconomic circumstances, your religious background. None of those things ultimately determine you. We are self-determining beings. We make ourselves who we are through our own meaning-giving choices and actions. And so existence doesn't have any sort of ground or stabilizing foundation to it. It's always a process of becoming who you are. And that process of becoming lasts until you physically die. So you are in a state of self-fashioning or self-making on your own deathbed, right? You can deny your former identity and your former commitments and choices right up until you take your last breath. And this is why I think physician-assisted suicide, or the option for dying with dignity, is such an important one, because it's one of the last manifestations of agency and free will that we can have in the face of total biophysical collapse. Now, whether or not there is a kind of essentialism to old age, a kind of universal thread that binds the experience of aging together, I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. Can you try to flesh that out?
Basically, it goes back to how, when it comes to, and I'm taking this from your book, Existential Philosophy, right? The one on the textbook, Existentialism.
Oh, yeah.
There are two components, right? There's facticity and there's transcendence.
Yeah.
And what I'm trying to ask is that, in some sense, right, the more is, especially like, let's take a look at where we are right now. There are even more and more accounts, scientific ones, of like what makes who we are. For example, there are neuroscientists or intellectuals who think that we don't have free will, who think that we are, in some sense, living in the world of determinism. There's always some kind of causal effect. So what I'm trying to suggest is that the more and more we develop this kind of sophisticated understandings of such things, of how they all make up explanations to explain our behavior, who we become, what kind of identities we adopt, shouldn't we, through understanding all that, then find pockets of the freedoms and the abilities for us to create meaning? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, I think that's
Yeah.
exactly right. And I'll say, the cognitive scientists and the neuroscientists that claim everything is causally determined. Of course, there's a lot of empirical evidence for this, but what is not answered by a reductive neurochemical or cognitive account is the fact that we are still free to interpret and give meaning to those causal influences. So this is oftentimes what's called the hard problem of consciousness in the philosophy of mind or in cognitive science. And cognitive science and philosophers of mind have not solved this problem at all. And because values and meanings aren't physical substances. They're not things that are in causal interaction with other things. And human existence and the fact that we are meaning-giving creatures falls outside of the purview of mechanistic materialism, of cause and effect. And values, meanings are not material things. But it opens up another interesting question about freedom and old age that you kind of alluded to. When we're young and healthy, we think freedom has something to do with the ability to do what we want. I am free to do what I want. I see the stairs, I'm going to climb up the stairs. I see the ski slope, I'm going to ski down the ski slope. I'm going to see the cheesecake, I'm going to eat the cheesecake. All of those are manifestations of free will, right? I make the choice. And if you see freedom as the ability to do what you want, existentialists say you're not actually free. You're a slave to your wants. You're enslaved to your desires and wants. And what true freedom is a freedom from wants, freedom from desire, a freedom from the desire to be something. And that notion of freedom from, or you don't want to call it negative freedom because that means something else, is something that comes to us, I think, in old age, where we're no longer wanting to be a certain kind of person. That desire for creating something fixed and stable and permanent and real starts to die out. And deep freedom or primordial freedom is a freedom from want, freedom from desire, freedom from freedom. And this is something that Heidegger will develop in his later philosophy, but it's also something you see in Buddhism, right? Freedom from attachments, freedom from worldly aspects of our identity that we cling to that creates the illusion that we're real. And so I think that's one of the ways that freedom can be nuanced as we move through the stages of life. And it's something that I tried to capture in that discussion of the ashrama system in Hindu philosophy towards the end of the book. And the other thing that's interesting in this question that you're asking is that, and one of the things that inspired the book is I was struck by the fact that so few existentialists engage the question of old age. And existentialism kind of has been stereotyped as a philosophy for the young, the people that are engaged in the world and active in politics and involved in social and political issues. And the only major figure that spends a serious time exploring old age happens to be a woman, Simone de Beauvoir. And she wrote this magisterial study called The Coming of Age, a poor translation of a French word, le vieux. But it exposes something about the woman's experience of age as opposed to the man's experience of age, where men can live in a state of denial much longer, and women start to confront their physicality at a much earlier age when they are no longer see themselves as objects of male desire. And this is something that Beauvoir teases out in a very bleak account of old age in Western capitalist societies.
No, I like that because I do want to draw an observation that I made about how yes, that not only Simone de Beauvoir was so present, right, in seeing this, but also like how right now older men seem to have an easier time, still making it in society. So, for example, there's still a fashion and movie industry that continues to promote the attractiveness or the social standing of much older men, and some of these older male actors, have very leading roles in movies like The Expendables. But the same image is not, extended to women, or maybe it will change in time. But the interesting thing about what Simone de Beauvoir was talking about was how this was all due to the structural factors of capitalism in dehumanizing the old and the poor. And so, she believed that a radical transformation is needed. Santosh, you want to jump in with something first?
No, I think I can see lots of parallels with the Buddhist Dharma school of thought, and then the Hindu Vedanta philosophy. It's almost the same thing. I feel like, yeah. So the whole idea of openness to mystery that you mentioned, I see that in my studies of a faith called the Baha'i. So in the Baha'i faith, there's this beautiful idea of progressive revelation. So life reveals its purpose to us progressively. Yeah. So the whole story and the whole vision is not revealed to us, but it's revealed to us. Because if you knew the entire story right from the beginning, then there'll be no fun. So there's this idea of being open to the mystery or the unfolding mystery of life. And that is something that's also in the Bible. Your word is a lamp unto my feet and a light upon the path. So the lamp, as I walk, the lamp is only able to shine light on a certain area or field of vision that I can walk towards. I can't see anything else after that. So once I finish walking that short distance, then the lamp is required for me to walk the next distance. But everything is dark around me. Yeah. And you need to be open to that mystery and have that faith. So we talked about the parallels in Baha'i, the parallels in Christianity, and also in Sufism. Yes. The great poet Rumi, he wrote a beautiful poem called Guest House. This being is a guest house. Welcome them all. Greet them laughing at the door. So that poem encapsulates this beautiful notion of openness to mystery as well. Yeah. So we've looked at looked at the Baha'i faith, Sufi faith, Christian faith, and I saw the same thing in the Hindu faith, the idea of moksha or mukti. Yeah. Or from the sheath of ignorance. It's the sheath of ignorance that binds us, that prevents us from seeing our true nature. So it's just beautiful. Yeah.
So I think what Santosh drew on here actually is that how there's this universal theme among religions. But also, Kevin, I also like to ask you to chime in. It seems as though from what Santosh has extrapolated that there's so much crossover concepts from religion to existentialism. And that's the interesting thing, because initially existentialism was meant to be a philosophy for atheists, right? Yeah. But it seems there are nevertheless this, crossover ideas.
Oh, they're very much so. And I'll say a couple of things about that. So one of the neat things about exploring these ideas is how they resurface in similar ways throughout all the great wisdom traditions. As you were just talking about, Eastern traditions, indigenous cultures, and strains in the Western tradition, Christianity, aspects of Judaism, Gnostic philosophy, and existentialists are tapping into those traditions, even when they're not explicitly acknowledging it. But we have to recognize that Eastern philosophy had a profound impact on the rise of 19th century existentialism, especially through Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. Schopenhauer was deeply indebted to Eastern philosophy, and Nietzsche learned so much from Schopenhauer. And the Heidegger Eastern connection is massive. It's a very rich and long lineage and Heidegger speaks about the Eastern traditions in all sorts of different places. And Being in Time was translated into Japanese 4 or 5 times before it was ever translated into English. You know, it wasn't translated into English until 1962. By then, there were already 4 different translations in Japanese and 2 in Korea. So it shows you its impact. The other thing about this notion of atheism, again, this is one of these misleading stereotypes of existentialism, these dark, navel-gazing atheists. And many of the most prominent and influential existentialists were Christians. You know, Søren, Kierkegaard, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Gabriel Marcel, Martin Buber was Jewish, but had a deep spiritual understanding. Paul Tillich, Karl Barth, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So there's a whole rich tradition in existentialism that is religious. I mean, Nietzsche, Sartre and Beauvoir, and Heidegger are kind of the most explicitly atheistic philosophers. But when we talk about atheism from the existentialist tradition, it doesn't strip the philosophy of its spiritual component. The atheism is really a criticism of religious doctrination, or the belief in some otherworldly realm, a heaven where the soul rises out of the body and dwells for time and all eternity. That's the atheism that you get in the existentialist tradition, and that Kierkegaard's an atheist in that regard, and so is Martin Buber. But the spiritual components, as you've already outlined, are deep and enduring in all sorts of strands of existentialism, where replace God with the word mystery. You know, there you have it, and you see that or see in Nietzsche's work the reverence for a figure like Dionysus, the Greek god of wine and artistic inspiration and emotionality and the earth. And so really what the atheism that emerges in the existentialist tradition is really a rejection of moral absolutes, that there is some sort of God out there that provides an enduring meaning and significance to our lives, that there's some sort of magical substance inside our bodies called a soul, and that substance lives on after we die forever in heaven. Existentialism just that's what Nietzsche means when he says God is dead. What dies is moral absolutes that can give our lives guidance, and nihilism is the recognition that there is no guidance, that we have to guide ourselves. And so, yeah, it's an interesting point, interesting question.
Yeah, I thought now would be quite a opportune moment to jump into something related to existentialism, which is ethics, morality. And, just a little bit earlier, we were talking about the idea about that there is no enduring self, there's no permanent or essential self. And so I just want to quote from your book, the textbook on existentialism. And it's regarding Sartre's concept of bad faith. And again, it goes back to deception, because I think it's something major to say about politics. So the quote goes like this: I am in bad faith when I deny the freedom I have to take a stand on my situation and see myself as not responsible on the grounds that I'm wholly determined by it. And I'm also in bad faith when I deny that I'm limited by my situation and see myself as wholly free and my life is completely open-ended. So it's kind of 2 examples there, right? Yeah. So the first one I feel is more intuitive to understand. So just to make it simple, we can imagine if, let's say, I'm in the work environment and I see my colleague get verbally or physically abused by the boss, and if I choose not to stand up and defend my colleague, I am somewhat responsible for that act being committed. The second one is a bit more counterintuitive to me, because I think the impression, as we've been talking, is that existentialists generally believe that life is, our existence is full of freedoms and all sorts of potentials for us to redefine ourselves. But I can't say you quoted Sartre, gave an intriguing example which relates to sexuality and gender politics, because he argued that even the homosexual who fixates on himself being homosexual is committing bad faith as well, because he's defined himself as a thing, which is, or a concept is being homosexual. And so it goes back to what I said just now about how there is two components of selfhood, right? I mean, in your book, you mentioned there's facticity and transcendence, and what it means is that regarding the latter property, is that whatever role identity I commit myself to, there is actually no fixed one, and it's always a constant back and forth and flux.
Yeah.
Now, I do think this is quite controversial to say, especially for identity-based movements like the LGBTQ, because they do consider their identities to be essential and to be fixed. So I'm trying to spin a question. So I guess what I want to ask is this one reason why, Sartre is not a figure for LGBTQ?
Yeah.
Yeah, because I think it's very yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I haven't given much thought to it, although, Sartre's partner, Simone de Beauvoir, has had a tremendous influence on, she created a second wave feminism. She gave birth to it. And so she is a towering figure, and in many ways has eclipsed Sartre as a figurehead of French existentialism. But I think Sartre would argue, yes, if you are a member of the LGBTQ community and you cling to that identity, you're actually in bad faith because you're denying the fact that you might change your mind. And part of what it means to be a self is to recognize that facticity and transcendence is a relational tension. And it's never resolved. It's never like, oh, now I realize who I am. I'm lesbian, or I'm queer, or I'm transsexual. Life is not fixed and static. And so you may come to realize I'm no longer seeing myself in that way, and my self-identity has shifted to something else. And Sartre will refer to this tension between facticity and transcendence, or being in itself and being for itself, as a situation of meta-stability, that we're constantly in relational tension with it. And whenever we say, no, I finally realized this is who I am, boom, you're already in self-deception. You're unwilling to accept and own up to the fundamental ambiguity at the core of the human condition. So ambiguity is another, is kind of a God term in French existentialism, a recognition of the murkiness and blurriness of the human situation. And when we have this aha moment and we realize, oh my gosh, this is who I really am, you've fallen into bad faith, because there is no real you to begin with. And to say that this is who I am as a fixed identity, is to deny the fact that you make yourself with your moment-to-moment choices and decisions. And so any identity you happen to cling to is always subject to negation by future choices and decisions. And my sense is that there are aspects of the LGBTQ movement that are quite open to this. That fluidity and dynamism in terms of my self-interpretation is very much a part of that community. That this is who I am today, and I may not be that tomorrow, but you have to allow me the freedom to be in that state of ambiguity, of relational tension. And the more you freeze my identity into a certain category, the more I'm going to resist and rebel. So I think you could argue that there's elements of the LGBTQ movement that are quite in line with existentialist philosophy and ethics.
Right. Yeah, I do think actually one of the major issues we have when it comes to sexuality is that people just have this idea that it's very innate and it's fixed and you can't change it. And, just to give some examples, you talk about how people change their gender identity. So the celebrity Demi Lovato just changed her pronoun from they, them to she, her. I'm also reminded of stuff that I've read, and this is back in the time when I was studying criminology, where men in prison would actually have sexual relations with other men, although they consider themselves heterosexual. They were obviously put in a situation where they engage in such acts, but they saw themselves in a certain way, and they were able to kind of work with it, become quite malleable with what they were doing and how they define themselves. So, and I think it also goes to relationship styles, because we have this also idea, which is very patriarchal in some sense, that human beings are just made to be monogamous. But obviously, human beings can be very different, and engage in different type of relationship arrangements.
And just on that point, Sartre and Beauvoir were both polyamorous and had multiple partners. And although within that relationship, they remained, committed to each other as partners until they died, until Sartre died. But one of the things that Beauvoir does so beautifully is she doesn't romanticize polyamory at all. I mean, she spends a lot of time in her novels and her memoirs talking about jealousy and insecurity, and she struggled with Sartre's affairs, and Sartre struggled with her affairs, although she didn't have nearly as many as Sartre. And so, one of the things that and this is, I think, Beauvoir's kind of a hero of mine in this regard, because her novels and her memoirs are so much a reflection of the struggles of her own life, and the recognition that freedom is always in situation. It's in a particular situation. You fashion yourself, or you make yourself in the context of a specific situation. And that's why that example of male prisoners is so interesting. The situation of being in prison opens you up to that malleability or that flexibility, that, oh my gosh, I'm a straight heterosexual man, but not in this situation, I'm not, you see? And I think that's a greght point.
Yeah, and moving on from that, right, I do want to talk a bit about economy. I mean, we just, Santosh brought up the idea about capitalism, and that's also pretty central to both Sartre and Beauvoir's politics. So the other good thing I love from your textbook, in this case, we're talking about the other book, is that you had a chapter on Marxism and feminism and Black existentialism. Yeah. And, a very important thing you talk about is this development from Jean-Paul Sartre about freedom, because he initially had a quote that was like, "The slave in chains is as free as his master," which was pretty ludicrous. and that was initially my disillusion as well. And I really appreciate that you wrote about his evolution in the book, where he started to recognize those blind spots, right? And he then had he recognized that material conditions do have serious constraints on one's freedom. And he had this philosophical distinction, right, between two kinds of freedom: freedom in consciousness and freedom in situation. And the latter is the one that pertains to how free a man is so determined by his social situation. So what I'd like to ask, Kevin, for you to do is, a very important philosophical school of thought that value adds into this is Marxism. And Marxism is still treated as a dirty word in political discourse. But I do think that from what you explained, it's very, crucial in value adding into existentialism. So can you kind of share, how does it do it? And, how does this conception of Marxism differs from the traditional one that we are, perhaps been taught?
Yeah, so Sartre's relationship with Marxism is long and complicated, and he really started, there were a couple of decisive events in his life that shaped this transition in his philosophy from radical freedom to freedom in situation. One was the Nazi occupation of Paris. That was profoundly unsettling. Another was the fact that he was imprisoned. He was a prisoner of war for a period of time, and that opened his eyes up to material conditions in ways that they weren't. A third was very powerful critiques from prominent Marxist philosophers, notably Henri Lefebvre and Georg Lukács, attacking Sartre's early conception of radical freedom. But a fourth element that shaped his experience or his transformation was visiting the United States and going to the Jim Crow South and witnessing the extent of the dehumanization of human beings that was legalized in the southern states in the US. And all of this kind of awakened Sartre to his own privilege as a relatively wealthy, highly educated white man. And saw how significant the social sphere, the limitations and constraints of the social sphere are in mediating our capacities for self-realization or self-fashioning. And so Sartre took those Marxist criticisms very seriously. And this shift took place really right after this hugely influential public lecture called Existentialism as a Humanism in the early 1940s. And from then on, you started to see the Marxist existentialism emerge. And it wasn't just, run-of-the-mill Marxism. I mean, Sartre identified with Maoism at a certain point in his life, which caused him no end of ridicule. But Sartre is not an orthodox Marxist by any means. I mean, and his criticism of orthodox Marxism is twofold. First, he doesn't agree with the orthodox position that history is unfolding teleologically towards a proletariat revolution. All right, this is something that certain sectors of Marxist philosophy believe, that the revolution is inevitable, and the contradictions and tensions of capitalism are going to reach such a fever pitch that the working class will come to consciousness, revolt, and we will create a situation of communism and take over the means of production. Sartre had no illusions that that was going to happen at all, because he believes that history unfolds contingently. It doesn't happen necessarily, it happens absurdly. The second criticism that he has with orthodox Marxism is the reduction of the individual to a collective, the reduction of the individual to a bourgeois or a proletariat. And for him, that strips away the dignity of the individual. That the bourgeois and proletariat classes are composed of individuals who make choices, and they choose certain kinds of acts that then define them. And that's one of the reasons why he says whether or not Marxism will ever, a Marxist economy will ever manifest in the Western world, it remains to be seen, because it depends on how how individuals will make choices. And so that rejection of Marxist collectivism and that rejection of Marx's teleological conception of history are his two criticisms of orthodox Marxism. But what he does recognize or take ownership of is the power of material conditions to limit and constrain individual freedom, and how important it is to work in such a way, in whatever way we can, to help those who are oppressed to realize their own freedom. And so what you have in Sartre's later period is him becoming much more socially and politically active in workers' revolutions and student revolts in the 1960s, with Marxist revolutionaries like Fidel Castro. He wrote the preface to Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, in terms of his criticism and the justification for violence amongst the French colonial project. And he starts to realize that what matters isn't just for the individual to realize their own freedom, that in order for me to realize my own freedom, you also need to be able to realize your freedom. And so from out of that, you get a very interesting ethical maxim in existentialism. And the maxim runs something like this: individuals should act in such a way as to realize their own freedom, but at the same time, help others realize their freedom. And when he's talking about others, he's generally talking about those who are undervalued, marginalized, and oppressed. And my sense is that Beauvoir is pulling the strings here. Beauvoir was teaching Sartre what she called la force des choses, the power of circumstances. And as a woman, Beauvoir had a speaking position and a level of gravity and authority that as a white man, Sartre just didn't have. She understood what oppression was and what it meant to be turned into an object. And Sartre, as a privileged white man, able-bodied white man, didn't have that privilege. So he had to be taught. And the Marxists taught him this, his partner Beauvoir taught him this, his own experiences in the war and his visits to the United States taught him this. And I think it's a great story about the legacy of Sartre in terms of his own intellectual development. Now, earlier existentialists, I mean, not earlier, but contemporary existentialists and figures that influenced Sartre had already made this claim. Maurice Merleau-Ponty developed this notion of mediated freedom in his Phenomenology of Perception. And of course, Heidegger is very well known for making it clear that choices aren't made in a vacuum. They're made within the context that you've been thrown into. That's what he means by thrown projection. We're thrown into a situation, and then that situation opens up possibilities for us to press into and project ourselves towards. And if you're thrown into a situation of poverty or slavery or dehumanization, you have a very limited scope of possibilities. Now, of course, Heidegger never explored those because he wasn't interested in those questions, but his thematic analysis of human existence opened up those possibilities for theoretical exploration. So Heidegger had a huge impact on contemporary social and political philosophy, especially the Frankfurt School of social theory.
Yeah, and I want to say, like, this is what I kind of appreciate from Sartre, because, he was very aware that, like, whether we want to work towards a, transformative future, whether it's through a revolution or through more reformist approaches, right? He was quite sure he couldn't count on men being good, or men necessarily, having that concern for the good of society. And I think he said something like, he considered that even after his death, some men would choose fascism or other forms of violence. And the more important point for me is to have no illusions about what humans can do. And I think that's what really appeals to me about existentialism. It's quite hypocrisy busting because you are, right?
Yeah, that's right. You are the sum of your actions and choices. You are the choices and actions you make. And so it's a philosophy of doing. If you're doing certain things and complicit in regimes of oppression and subjugation, you're an oppressor and a subjugator. That's who you are. And so think about this in terms of the emergence of fascist and authoritarian politics in the Western world and in the Asian world. Human beings are making choices that demonstrate complicity in the rise of fascism. I mean, think about Trumpism in the United States and the Make America Great movement. This is fascist politics, and human beings are making choices to align themselves with that, which makes them fascist. That's what you are. And so one of the things that's so great about Sartre and Beauvoir's political philosophy is it's humble. It's like there's no great system, there's no great argument for structural change. Beauvoir calls this letting go of the dream of purity. That human beings are struggling, they're impure, they make choices, but you're responsible for the choices you make. And because those choices define you and they make you who you are. So you have to live with those choices. You have to live with what you've contributed to the rise or fall of culture, of civilization, of populations, of the earth itself. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Santosh, I want to give you a chance to ask something. And then, Kevin, is it okay to stick on for at least another 10, 15 minutes? Okay, great. So, Santosh, why don't you go ahead, and then I have some finishing questions.
No, I think this sounded a little bit like our conversation on misanthropy.
Oh,
so, yeah, it's the same thing.
That's another episode. Just to let Kevin know, that's an episode that I did with another philosophy professor.
Yeah,
so very cool.
Yeah, the idea of letting go of the dream of purity, this is exactly the conversation we had on misanthropy. And it turned out the conversation wasn't even pessimistic at all. It was very optimistic, and it was healing, and it was wholesome. So I just had a question. I think it's with regards to the hard problem of defining consciousness and our true self or our true nature. I've been studying Vedanta philosophy, and what it postulates is that it's beyond nama rupa, name and form, or the the sense perceptions.
Mhm.
Yeah. So beyond concepts of the mind or the sense perceptions lies the true self. And the true self cannot be described.
Mm.
And that is the Atman or the Brahman, the soul. And
Yeah,
yeah,
that's
now it's very difficult to prove this. I mean, I went on a practical, like a journey of trying to meditate my way to understand this conceptless, nameless, formless experience of myself. It's tough, but I don't know whether this is true. But how do you even prove that this is even possible when it's nameless and formless?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I think Buddhist philosophy comes closest to capturing this notion through its conception of dependent origination, that all things are dependent on all other things to exist. And so that the human being is not a self-contained atomistic entity. The human being exists because it is interdependent with all other things, not just on the earth, but in the cosmos itself. So I don't know if you saw this. There's a great poem by the Vietnamese Buddhist philosopher who just passed away, Thich Nhat Hanh, who says the universe is contained in this sheet of paper, because in this sheet of paper is the tree that that was cut down, and the corn that fed the logger who cut the tree down, and the water that came from the clouds that fed the tree, and the circumnavigation of the earth around the sun, and the sun creating a habitable solar system, or one planet within that solar system. And so this one piece of paper contains everything in the universe, in the cosmos. And that's how we should see ourselves. So you're not a self, you're no self, because you are fundamentally bound together and interdependent on everything else in the cosmos. And I don't know if you have seen those images that have come out of the Webb telescope that have been floating around on social media, these magisterial, awesome images of deep space and galaxies forming and suns dying and new stars coming into being. And that experience of awe in recognizing that that's where we come from, that cosmic mystery, that somehow our lives don't belong here on this little planet that's going to be swallowed by the sun when the sun turns into a red giant in a couple million years. We belong to this whole cosmic event that is incomprehensible and profoundly mysterious and awe-inspiring. It's not necessarily an experience of anxiety. It's awe and wonder, which, according to the Greeks, that's the original mood of philosophy. To look at existence and look at our lives and our relationship to the earth with awe and wonder, instead of with anxiety and dread and being motivated by control and mastery of the earth. And so there are ways to grasp it, but not through logical argumentation. They're grasped through mood experiences or mystical experiences of profound insight. But the insight cannot be captured linguistically. And this is what makes mystical experiences ineffable. So generally, William James captured this in his conception of the varieties of religious experiences. Mystical experiences are unique in the sense that they're noetic. In other words, you had a mystical experience, you know it. But the problem is they're ineffable. You can't explain the experience to other people because we're constrained by the limits of our own concepts, by the limits of language. And then the third characteristic is that the experience is fleeting. It's transient. It doesn't last. And so it comes and goes when it will. And that's frustrating to Westerners, because we like to see ourselves as being able to control and manipulate reality through our concepts or through the innovations of technoscience. But when you're asking the biggest questions, concepts and technology and scientific innovation can't get us there.
Wow.
Yeah, and that actually leads to one question that I thought about, which is this idea that, you just said that science and technology can get us there. And, we talk a lot about death, obviously, just now. And there is, on the other hand, a intellectual, that's Yuval Noah Harari, who actually thought that death is just a technical problem. Right? He thought that it's a problem that we can solve, and there is a possibility for us to live in perpetuity. So I'm very curious, what's the existentialist take on this? Is this something you want to look forward to?
It's very interesting. And so a friend of mine just wrote a book called Existentialism and the Desirability of Immortality, or maybe it's Existentialism and Immortality, where he actually engages these questions and tends to agree with this kind of life extension philosopher Harari. I don't agree with it at all. I think it's actually heterodox to existentialism. And my argument would be that kind of life extension gurus are living in states of repressed death anxiety, that death is quite terrifying to them. And so their focus is on how can I extend life for as long as possible, or maybe conquer death as a medical problem, a biological problem, and live forever. For the existentialists, and this goes back to Kierkegaard, without death, life has no purpose. The recognition of death is the thing that gives life its urgency and intensity and gravity. Without a kind of lucid and clear-eyed recognition that my life will come to an end, what's the point of doing anything? And so some philosophers, Bernard Williams is one, English-speaking philosopher, argues that immortality gurus aren't understanding that the consequence of their project is boredom. Who wants to live forever, right? I mean, isn't there a point where you've done everything that you're interested in? You've had all the sexual relationships, consumed all the food, seen all the virtual reality scenarios, gone to Mars with Elon Musk. What else do you want? And so boredom or complacency or indifference would be the result of immortality. And it is heterodox to the message of existentialism, that existentialism, the vital insight of existentialism is the recognition that our time is limited and that we need to treat this moment, this day, this relationship, this conversation that we're having with the seriousness and urgency that it demands, because the future is an illusion. It's not something that you can take for granted. And of course, that's what my heart attack taught me, right? You don't get a tomorrow. You don't get a next, an hour from now necessarily. And so without that kind of clear-eyed recognition, what's the point of living at all? What's the point of even getting out of bed, right? To watch another movie, to play another video game, to have another piece of sushi? Death is Kierkegaard's line is, death is a force that gives life meaning. Without it, we're just drifting along. And and that's why near-death experiences and even things as disturbing as a heart attack or a cancer diagnosis have been referred by survivors as the most important moment of their lives. That their lives were actually enhanced and enriched after the cancer diagnosis, or in my case, after the heart attack, not the other way around. It actually made life more interesting because it reminded you that life is not a dress rehearsal. It's not something that you can take for granted.
Yeah, I just want to add a quick note that besides your books, another book, philosophy book that I also read, which buttressed the point you just made about the value of a life with mortality, is by philosopher Martin Hopland. I think it's called This Life, Secular Freedom. So it's a book where he's not an existentialist as far as I can tell, but he talks about how it's very important that what you do in this life matters. And that can only be because you are going to die one day. Because if you can
I like that.
Right.
I like that. You see how much that resonates to the existentialist project. And this is the undercurrent of existential psychotherapy, that it pulls us out of entrenched patterns of self-deception and wakens you up to this moment, that this is not a dress rehearsal. And your choices matter. Your choices shape your life, and your life is uncertain in terms of what the future holds. So I like that idea. I don't know this philosopher, but it sounds like he would resonate with figures like Sartre. I mean, with especially Kierkegaard and Heidegger.
Yeah. So the book is here. I have it here. So it's this one.
Ooh, I like that. Okay.
Yeah. So
I'm gonna
maybe
check
you might
that
want to
out.
give it a read.
Yeah, I will. That sounds a lot like this book. Very much.
So I want to do this. I just want to kind of finish up with 3 questions, and the reason is because one question pertains to the ending of the book, One Beat More. The other question is the ending of the textbook that you have, and then the last one is a fun question for you. So let me just go with this book first, One Beat More, because we talked about it just now that to cap off the ending of your book, you brought up this Heideggerian transformation. This sense of release, from worldly attachments and realizing the finitude of your own life, and gaining a sense of a sense of the impermanence and the poignancy of life. And you brought up Oliver Sacks as well, who also came to that kind of transformation. So look, Kevin, you're certainly not at the last of your days, and you already gave an account of this transformation. I'd like to hear, from your own words, even ostensibly, right? Your life hasn't changed dramatically in the sense of like you don't have a different job. You're not, as far as I can tell, bungee jumping, insane stunts. Life pretty much, like I said, from the outset looks the same, but something has changed for you. So why don't you tell us in your own words what has changed?
Well, what the biggest change for me after the heart attack, now I'll say that for a good year and a half after the heart attack, I was gripped with anxiety and dread. I had a number of health-related complications to the heart attack that were life-threatening. And I lived in a state of acute anxiety for months and months. But part of the recovery was writing this book and working through the trauma and the wound of the illusion of vulnerability, the recognition that I'm vulnerable and open and can die at any moment. And so the big lesson in terms of enriching my life is putting things in their proper perspective. This is what Irvin Yalom, the great existential psychotherapist, calls trivializing the trivial. I've become much better at letting things that shouldn't cause me distress wash off my back. Department politics, an article that gets rejected at a journal, a fight with a friend or a colleague. They don't keep me up at night in the way that they used to keep me up. I have a richer sense of what really matters in life, my relationships, the small and modest contribution that I can make to the philosophical community, and also a deeper appreciation for the fact that all of us are suffering. All of us are struggling with the question of what it means to be. And we're all trying to make our way in this world. And so it's opened me up to reservoirs of compassion and tenderness that were closed off from me when I was quote unquote healthy and invulnerable. And but with that said, the ego always emerges again and starts to take control, and the insight or the awakening that the heart attack brought to me can start to fade away. And part of the lesson of existentialism is to live in a state of anticipatory readiness, be ready for the next world collapse. Because even though I recovered from my heart attack, I can't recover from existence itself. I will die. I will die of something. I could be hit by a bus when I'm riding my bike tomorrow. And so this is why the language that we get in healthcare, like he beat cancer or he beat the heart attack and he's going to live. That's a lie. You know, you may not die of a heart attack today, but you might tomorrow, and you may not have cancer now, but you might in a couple of weeks. And so, reminding myself of life's precariousness and of my own vulnerability allows me to live with a level of joy and urgency that I didn't have before. But the temptation to get sucked down the path of self-deception is always there. So it's not as if I've reached this nirvana state and I'm now, serene. I'm a human being and I'm struggling and I'm trying to, live a meaningful life. But there's a little bit more clarity to that struggle now.
Yeah, that's very poetic and beautiful, and I feel like that really speaks to what, on a personal level, we can do. What we can learn from your book and your experience. Then, like I said, my other question relates to the ending of your other book, where you actually brought up, on a societal level, right? We are experiencing a kind of eco-anxiety, and that speaks to the possibility of another kind of collapse, civilizational collapse. And on our channel, we do talk a lot about this because we are very concerned about climate change. And you use actually a quote from Greta Thunberg, and I liked it because that very eponymous quote. She says that we don't want your hope. I don't want to be hopeful. We want you to panic. And she was saying that to the adults in the room, which I think are living a kind of self-deception about where we are. So look, I think we talked quite a lot about existentialism doesn't really have a sort of explicit normative set of ethics. But nevertheless, we do feel like there is something to be said about the wickedness of being disengaged with the world or being self-centered. And further, there is a certain virtue, I think, in confronting existential anxiety, because not even just for ourselves, but even for maybe other beings and other in the world. And that, if we aren't anxious, I feel like there's something inhuman about it. Like it's not right that you're not anxious. So I just want to ask you, am I reading this right? That's one. And then two, also, going along with what we said just now about passing judgments, should we pass judgments on people who choose to ignore that eco-anxiety that will be suffered by, our future generations or,
I think you've read me just right. I mean, that's exactly the message that I wanted to convey. We can't judge others for being bad or evil because there's no objective measure to determine what good or evil is. I mean, this is why Nietzsche says we need to go beyond good and evil, and why Kierkegaard says we need to suspend our commitments to the ethical. But we can say that those people that are in denial of climate change are living in a profound state of self-deception. And they're being fundamentally dishonest with themselves, and they are threatening the existence of future generations. But self-deception isn't necessarily a moral failing. It's human all too human. And there have been genocides and catastrophes, human caused catastrophes throughout civilization. And this one is unique because it threatens the planet as a whole. And it threatens the possibility of a meaningful existence for children. And this is why children and young adults are most poignantly aware of the climate crisis, and why Greta Thunberg has been this courageous spokesperson, because she's speaking for future generations. And so I judge these people as being morally loathsome who deny climate change. But that doesn't mean that they are actually loathsome as moral agents. It means they're scared, they're living in a state of self-deception, and they don't want to be honest with themselves. They don't want to be honest with what the data, the empirical evidence, the science says. They either are selfish and greedy and they only care about their own existence, or they're willfully ignorant about what the preponderance of sheer scientific data tells us.
I just want to add one other person to that list because just as we learned recently, Alex Jones, an American host, has been found guilty of defamation because he denied the reality of the Sandy Hook massacre, and he had to
Yes,
confront
exactly.
that
Exactly.
in court.
He, by any measure, is a morally loathsome human being and should spend many, many years behind bars. But the problem with people like Alex Jones is he has thousands and millions of people that listen to him and believe him. They don't believe in science. They don't believe in the evidence of their own sight, right? That these things are happening. And we've seen this with the election in the United States. People deny that the election of our president was legal and viable. And so, yes, we can't say that their behavior is good or evil, although I say it's evil. we would say as existentialists that they're living in a state of self-deception, that they're not honest. And that's a sad way to live a life.
Okay, Santosh, do you want to add one last thing before I ask the final question?
No, I think at the end of the day, it boils down to the things that we attach to. So it's about attachment. And then on the flip side of the coin of attachment, it's loss aversion. What are you willing to give up? And what is the new reality that we would live? What are the things that we need to shed off? And that is very difficult to confront.
Yeah, so it's a really good question. So philosophers, especially philosophers working in bioethics and environmental ethics, are struggling with this right now because a big part of the life of a philosopher is international travel, to fly on supersonic jets that burn enormous amounts of fossil fuel to give a talk at a conference on the perils of fossil fuels, right? So we are participants in that hypocrisy. Like, we have these huge annual meetings every year where thousands of philosophers get on planes and fly around the world to get together and talk about the problems of modern capitalism and jet travel. So these are real points of philosophical concern.
No, Kevin, I'm glad you brought it up because it's definitely something I see arising within the academia community, and how there's certain climate activists and voices out there, intellectuals, who talk about this problem. Okay, let me just give you the last fun question. Okay, so Kevin, you must know the popular comic Existentialist Comics.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so he had this 3 guidelines for calling himself an existentialist. So number 1, be super existential all the time. Number 2, refuse to label yourself an existentialist. And number 3, lots of smoking. So I think you and I will agree number 3 is not really important. It's not a requisite. But has pointed out by the other existentialist philosopher, Sky Cleary, who I also read, she does note that a lot of existentialists don't like being labeled that category. And she herself agreed there is no need to refer to oneself as an existentialist, because according to her, existentialism is something you do, it's not something that you are. So do you think this explains the refusal, for existentialist philosophers like yourself to take on that label? But
I agree with Sky Cleary, and Sky is a brilliant philosopher of existentialism, especially Simone de Beauvoir. And she actually was gracious enough to write a blurb for my textbook on existentialism. But the situation of self-identifying with existentialism is much more complicated than that. The word wasn't coined until 1943 by Gabriel Marcel, whereas existentialist philosophy had been going on for over 100 years by then, with Kierkegaard and with Nietzsche and with Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. And the word existentialism was really meant to capture a particular kind of approach to the human condition that manifested in the work of Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir. And so they were the figures that self-identified with existentialism. And Heidegger rejected the label or the association with French existentialists, especially Sartre, because he saw it as fundamentally a subjectivism, a radical individualism. And Heidegger rejects the idea that human existence is an individualistic affair. It's a shared, joint, communal project. So being in the world for Heidegger is always being there with others. We're always bound up in relations. And this is something that Sartre comes to realize in his later writings, that human beings are bound up in community, in the social sphere, in the material conditions of our lives. And so even in his later period, it would be hard pressed for Sartre to say that he's still an existentialist. But what binds these figures together is a concern with what it means to be human. How are we supposed to live our lives? What are we supposed to do in the face of the unsettling givens of our condition? And so in that sense, Skye Cleary is right. So if you self-identify as an existentialist, you have to realize that you're also not an existentialist, because you can negate that identity at any time through your own free meaning-giving choices. But the existentialism that I'm interested in is more like an attitude. It's a way of living. It's a way of approaching life, being curious about what it means to be human, thinking carefully about how we treat others and relate to the natural world. And in that sense, I'm in complete agreement with Skye.
Right. That's a really, really beautiful way of ending our session, and a way of helping others, viewers and ourselves to kind of understand what really gets into the heart of existentialism, and what, at least for me, makes it really appealing, and something that I really enjoy, reading about. Kevin, thanks so much for your time. As you said, we had a very meaningful discussion. I love it. I know there's nothing fake about it. and I really appreciate you being authentic and being honest with us. For us it's midnight, but for you it's afternoon, obviously.
And I want to say thank you to both of you for putting this event together and for supporting my work. And this has been the highlight of my week. This is one of the most enjoyable conversations I've had in a long time. And the fact that you grappled with these questions seriously and asked thoughtful and meaningful questions just means the world to me. So thank you so much for the work that you're doing and getting the message out there. And I look forward to future projects.
Thank you. I look forward to having you again on the show.
Okay. Talk to you soon.
Kevin.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.